10 terrifying true home alone horror stories you won't believe. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Shannon sat on the couch, staring at the flickering TV screen. Her parents were away for the weekend. She had been left alone. Not that it bothered her much. It was a big house, though. Too big for just one person. The rooms seemed to stretch endlessly, and there was always an eerie stillness that hung in the air. The walls, painted a pale beige, felt too close sometimes. Even now, the shadows seemed deeper, as if they were watching her. She tried to shake the feeling, but the silence pressed down on her chest. Her phone buzzed, breaking the tension. It was a message from her mom. "Just checking in, sweetheart. Everything okay?" Shannon smiled, typing back quickly. "Yeah, all good. Just watching TV. I'll be fine." She hit send and looked around again. Something felt off. The house felt different tonight. She shook her head, brushing it off as nothing. But then she heard it. A soft creak from upstairs. Her eyes darted to the stairs, but there was nothing. It was probably just the house settling. She tried to ignore it, but then came another sound. A faint dragging noise. It came from above. Slow. Unsteady. She froze. Her heart beat faster. Was someone up there? She stood up, her legs shaky, and grabbed the baseball bat her dad kept in the closet. "Just the wind," she whispered to herself. But then the dragging stopped, and in the dead silence, she heard a soft whisper. "Shannon." Her blood ran cold. The voice was barely audible, but it was clear. It wasn't her mom. It wasn't anyone she knew. Her feet felt glued to the floor. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Shannon, come up." The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Then the lights flickered. The house plunged into darkness. She gasped. The faint whispering was gone, but the air was heavier now. The shadows seemed to stretch across the walls, like they were alive. "Shannon," came the voice again, closer this time. She turned around. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A tall, shadowed figure. No face. No features. Just darkness. Shannon's heart stopped. The figure stood motionless, blocking the doorway. Shannon's breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, to move, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The silence between them was suffocating. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, deafening in the stillness. Then a slow, deliberate step forward. The figure didn't move like a person. It was almost as if it was gliding. Shannon's eyes widened. She took a tentative step back, but the figure followed. No sound. No movement. Just that heavy, oppressive presence. Her pulse raced. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the bat tighter. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Who are you?" Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. It just kept coming. Each step closer, until it was inches away from her. Shannon's chest tightened. The air grew colder. She could see her breath now, thin and white in the cold, stale air. Her hand shook as she lifted the bat. The figure didn't flinch. It was as if it wasn't even aware of the weapon. Shannon swung. Hard. But the bat passed right through the figure, like it wasn't even there. A cold gust of wind blasted past her, throwing her off balance. She stumbled backward, her legs collapsing beneath her. And then, the figure was gone. The room fell silent once more. Shannon was left gasping, trembling, lying on the floor, bat still clutched in her hand. Her mind raced. What just happened? The lights flickered back on. And there, standing at the foot of the stairs, was a shadow. But this time it was different. It wasn't the same thing. This one moved. It darted down the hall. Her heart stopped. Shannon scrambled to her feet, adrenaline flooding her body. She didn't care anymore. She had to get out. But as she ran to the door, something stopped her. A sound. A faint, familiar whisper. "Shannon." It called again. This time, it was right behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the darkness. and the feeling that she was never truly alone. Then, the door slammed shut, and the lights went out again. Complete darkness. Shannon's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The darkness felt thicker now, like a heavy blanket pressing down on her. Her heart thudded in her chest as she fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. She turned, desperate, eyes wide in the pitch-black room. A cold wind swept through the hallway again, brushing past her skin like icy fingers. She froze. The whisper came again, louder this time, closer. Shannon. Her whole body went rigid. It was so close, she could feel the breath on her neck. And then, just like that, it was gone. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was suffocating, oppressive. She couldn't breathe. Shannon's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the darkness. Then, her phone buzzed in her pocket, loud in the stillness. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. It was a text from her mom. "Sweetheart? Are you okay? The neighbor just called. He saw something moving in the windows." Her hands were shaking as she read the message. What did he mean? Something moving in the windows? Shannon turned, her eyes searching the empty room. She couldn't see anything. But then, in the far corner of the room, something shifted. A dark shape. She took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The shape moved again. It wasn't a shadow. It was real. Shannon squinted, trying to make out the figure. Then, it slowly turned to face her. It had no face, just smooth, featureless darkness. The figure took a step forward, and Shannon's blood ran cold. Her feet wouldn't move. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed, trapped in place by the terrifying presence that now loomed before her. The figure reached out a hand. A cold, bony hand. Shannon screamed, finally able to move. She lunged for the door again, desperate, pulling with all her strength. But it was useless. The door wouldn't open. The hand was closer now. It touched her shoulder. A jolt of cold shot through her body, freezing her in place. Her vision blurred. Her body felt weightless. And then, everything went black. The next thing Shannon knew, she was lying on the floor. The door was open. The house was silent again. She shakily stood up, disoriented, her mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. But then, as she looked around, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The shadows, they weren't just in the corners. They were moving. They were alive. And they were closing, and Shannon's breath quickened as the shadows stretched toward her, their dark forms undulating like smoke. Her eyes darted from corner to corner, but there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in, the space around her shrinking with each passing second. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She had to get out, had to leave before the darkness consumed her. But her legs felt weak, unsteady. She took one hesitant step toward the door. The shadows were almost on her now, swirling around her feet like thick, cold mist. Another step. The door loomed just ahead, but it felt miles away. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. And then, without warning, there was a sound. A scraping noise.
Low. Slow.
Shannon's heart skipped a beat. It was coming from behind her. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows had formed into something more. A figure. It was tall, hunched, and impossibly thin. Its arms were too long, hanging down to the ground. Its face was a blank void, no eyes, no mouth, just blackness. It tilted its head to one side, as if studying her. And then it moved. The air grew thick with an unnatural pressure, as if the figure itself was pulling the very oxygen from the room. Shannon stumbled backward, her legs failing her once again. The figure took one slow, deliberate step toward her. The closer it got, the colder the air became. It felt like she was suffocating. She needed to get away. She needed to. The lights flickered. And in that brief moment of darkness, the figure was gone. The room was silent. Shannon stood frozen, gasping for breath. What was happening? She reached for the door handle again, her hand shaking violently. The door creaked open, just enough for her to squeeze through. She stepped out into the hallway, the cold air biting at her skin. But she didn't feel safe. She couldn't explain it, but something deep inside her knew this wasn't over. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to leave this house behind. But where would she go? As if answering her unspoken question, a voice filled the hallway. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. But it was there. And it spoke her name. Shannon. It came from all around her, echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound. Shannon's blood ran cold. And she turned, just in time to see the figure appear again, this time closer. Its cold, empty face tilted toward her. "Come back," it whispered. "Come back and stay forever." And before she could react, the shadows surged forward. The last thing she saw was the dark hand reaching for her, engulfing everything in its cold embrace. Then nothing to Shannon's eyes fluttered open, but she couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. Her body was frozen, pressed against something cold and hard. She tried to move, but it felt as though her limbs were trapped in concrete. Panic surged through her chest, and she fought against the invisible chains holding her down. But nothing moved. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her vision blurred, and she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The walls were dark, not the pale beige they once were, but a deep, oppressive black. The room seemed to stretch, expanding in every direction, yet shrinking at the same time. Everything felt wrong. Her head spun as she tried to focus on something, anything. Then, a soft whisper echoed in her mind, like a distant voice calling her name. "Shannon." She jolted, heart pounding. The shadows in the room shifted. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures. Shapes. Formless, but unmistakably there. They circled around her, moving in unison, as if they were part of the same being. Shannon's breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling with fear. She tried to sit up, to stand, to escape, but nothing worked. It was as though she was trapped in a nightmare. Then, from the deepest corner of the room, the figure appeared once more. Its tall, skeletal frame emerged from the darkness. Its face, if it could be called that, was a featureless void, but Shannon could feel its gaze on her, piercing through her very soul. The figure spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers, hollow and ancient. "You shouldn't have left." The words echoed around her, vibrating in her chest. Shannon's heart slammed in her ribs. "Left," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. The figure took a step toward her, the air growing colder with each movement. "You thought you could escape," it continued, its voice growing darker, deeper. "But you belong here, with us." Shannon's mind raced. Escape? She didn't remember leaving. She was back?
No, that couldn't be right.
She was in the hallway moments ago. She had to have been. The figure's long, spindly fingers reached out, grazing the air with a chill that made her skin crawl. "Come with us," it urged, its voice a sickly sweet melody. "You've always been one of us." Shannon closed her eyes, willing herself to wake up, to shake off this nightmare. But nothing happened. The figure was still there, looming over her, its shadow stretching longer and longer. "Stay," it whispered again, its voice like a slow, crawling fog. Shannon felt herself being pulled into the shadows, drawn in like a moth to a flame. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't breathe. And then, the room was swallowed in darkness, once more. The last thing she heard was the figure's voice, faint but clear. "You are ours." And then everything went silent. The oppressive weight of the darkness fell away, and Shannon was gone. The house was empty once more. But the shadows remained, waiting. The silence in the house was suffocating, as if the very walls held their breath. The shadows, once ominous and thick, slowly began to retreat. But they did not disappear. They lingered, moving like smoke in the corners of the rooms. Outside, the night was still. The world seemed unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within these walls. The front door creaked open. A gust of cold air swept through the house. A figure stepped inside. It was a man, older, with graying hair and an anxious look on his face. His name was Mr. Harris, the neighbor. He had been worried about Shannon after hearing strange things from the street. The lights in the house were dimmed, but he could make out the shape of the furniture in the dim light. The air felt wrong. He glanced around, feeling an unfamiliar chill in the room. He hesitated at the foot of the stairs, looking up into the darkness above. He could hear it now, the faintest of whispers. "Shannon?" His voice echoed through the empty house, but there was no response. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Shannon, it's me, Mr. Harris." His footsteps creaked as he made his way through the hall, his eyes scanning the rooms. It was too quiet, too still. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He walked toward the living room, his hand resting on the back of the couch. And that's when he noticed it. A faint trail of cold air drifting from the hallway. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a presence. Something dark. He swallowed hard and stepped closer to the source of the cold. There, lying in the center of the floor, was Shannon's phone. The screen was cracked, but the message was still visible. Asterisk, sweetheart? Are you okay? The neighbor just called. He saw something moving in the windows. Asterisk. His stomach turned. Where was Shannon? He looked around the room, his heart racing. And then, from the hallway, he heard it. A soft whisper. "Shannon." It was faint, but unmistakable. He turned toward the stairs, but something stopped him. A sudden, overwhelming pressure filled the room, the walls seemingly closing in. Mr. Harris stumbled backward, his eyes widening in horror. Something moved in the corner of his vision. A shadow. No, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more. The figure from before, tall, gaunt, and featureless, emerged from the dark. Its presence was suffocating, like it was pulling the very life out of him. The air turned frigid. The whispers grew louder. "Come back." The figure's arms stretched toward him, its bony fingers twitching with unnatural speed. Mr. Harris took one step back, then another, but the shadows followed. There was no escape. The house itself seemed to hold him in place, trapping him within its cursed walls. The figure spoke again, its voice a slow, grating hiss. "You're next." And then, the darkness closed in. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. And the whispers began again, louder this time, as the shadows swallowed him whole. Outside, the street was quiet once more. No one saw or heard what happened next. No one saw the shadowy figures that now gathered in the house, waiting. And no one saw the dark, empty windows staring out into the night. But in the stillness of the house, one thing was certain. It was never truly empty. Not anymore, but the house stood silent, its walls holding tight to the secrets it had claimed. The shadows that had once moved like smoke were now still, watching. Inside, there was only the cold, an unnatural chill that clung to the air. "Come with us," it urged, its voice a sickly sweet melody. "You've always been one of us." Shannon closed her eyes, willing herself to wake up, to shake off this nightmare. But nothing happened. The figure was still there, looming over her, its shadow stretching longer and longer. "Stay," it whispered again, its voice like a slow, crawling fog. Shannon felt herself being pulled into the shadows, drawn in like a moth to a flame. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't breathe. And then, the room was swallowed in darkness, once more. The last thing she heard was the figure's voice, faint but clear. "You are ours." And then everything went silent. The oppressive weight of the darkness fell away, and Shannon was gone. The house was empty once more. But the shadows remained. Waiting, the silence in the house was suffocating, as if the very walls held their breath. The shadows, once ominous and thick, slowly began to retreat. But they did not disappear. They lingered, moving like smoke in the corners of the rooms. Outside, the night was still. The world seemed unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within these walls. The front door creaked open. A gust of cold air swept through the house. A figure stepped inside. It was a man, older, with graying hair and an anxious look on his face. His name was Mr. Harris, the neighbor. He had been worried about Shannon after hearing strange things from the street. The lights in the house were dimmed, but he could make out the shape of the furniture in the dim light. The air felt wrong. He glanced around, feeling an unfamiliar chill in the room. He hesitated at the foot of the stairs, looking up into the darkness above. He could hear it now, the faintest of whispers. "Shannon?" His voice echoed through the empty house, but there was no response. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Shannon, it's me, Mr. Harris." His footsteps creaked as he made his way through the hall, his eyes scanning the rooms. It was too quiet, too still. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He walked toward the living room, his hand resting on the back of the couch. And that's when he noticed it. A faint trail of cold air drifting from the hallway. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a presence. Something dark. He swallowed hard and stepped closer to the source of the cold. There, lying in the center of the floor, was Shannon's phone. The screen was cracked, but the message was still visible. Asterisk, sweetheart? Are you okay? The neighbor just called. He saw something moving in the windows. Asterisk. His stomach turned. Where was Shannon? He looked around the room, his heart racing. And then, from the hallway, he heard it. A soft whisper. "Shannon." It was faint, but unmistakable. He turned toward the stairs, but something stopped him. A sudden, overwhelming pressure filled the room, the walls seemingly closing in. Mr. Harris stumbled backward, his eyes widening in horror. Something moved in the corner of his vision. A shadow. No, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more. The figure from before, tall, gaunt, and featureless, emerged from the dark. Its presence was suffocating, like it was pulling the very life out of him. The air turned frigid. The whispers grew louder. "Come back." The figure's arms stretched toward him, its bony fingers twitching with unnatural speed. Mr. Harris took one step back, then another, but the shadows followed. There was no escape. The house itself seemed to hold him in place, trapping him within its cursed walls. The figure spoke again, its voice a slow, grating hiss. "You're next." And then, the darkness closed in. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. And the whispers began again, louder this time, as the shadows swallowed him whole. Outside, the street was quiet once more. No one saw or heard what happened next. No one saw the shadowy figures that now gathered in the house, waiting. And no one saw the dark, empty windows staring out into the night. But in the stillness of the house, one thing was certain. It was never truly empty. Not anymore, but the house stood silent, its walls holding tight to the secrets it had claimed. The shadows that had once moved like smoke were now still, watching. Inside, there was only the cold, an unnatural chill that clung to the air. Hours passed. The faintest hum of life, outside, seemed miles away. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced against the windows. But inside, no one moved. No one spoke. And the house waited. Far away, in the distance, a car pulled up to the curb. The headlights cut through the night, briefly illuminating the old house. A woman stepped out, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. Her name was Sarah, and she was Shannon's aunt. She had been trying to reach her niece for hours, ever since her sister, Shannon's mother, hadn't received any replies. A sense of dread had settled in her chest as she approached the house, but she didn't let it show. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of dust and something else, something colder, like wet stone. "Shannon?" Sarah called out, her voice hesitant. The quiet stretched around her, pressing against her ears. No answer. She stepped further into the house, each step creaking under her weight. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of life. The living room was still, save for the dim light that flickered from the hallway. She hesitated before walking toward it, her feet moving on their own, Driven by a sense of urgency she couldn't quite explain. The floorboards groaned as she approached the stairs. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, but she ignored them. It was probably just the lighting, she told herself. But as she climbed the stairs, the air grew heavier, colder.
A sound.
A whisper. Her name. Sarah? The voice was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. She froze. The whisper came again, this time closer, more insistent. Sarah, come up. The cold in the air seemed to wrap around her, suffocating, like an invisible hand pressing against her chest. Her pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, but the stairs behind her were empty. Just darkness. Shannon, she called out again, her voice trembling now. Her breath formed a cloud in the icy air. The whisper didn't stop. It grew louder. Sarah, to come closer. It was coming from upstairs. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move forward. With each step, the house seemed to exhale, the shadows stretching toward her like tendrils. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was darker than before. The doors were shut tight, but there, in the center of the hallway, was a faint light. It flickered, unstable, like the last breath of something alive. Her heart thudded in her chest as she approached. And then she saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the doorway. Shannon. But it wasn't Shannon. Her niece stood there, but her eyes were black, empty voids, staring at Sarah without recognition. Her face was pale, too pale, and her mouth stretched into a hollow grin. Shannon? Sarah whispered, taking a step forward. But Shannon didn't respond. The room behind her was dark, impossibly dark, and the figure in the doorway did not move. The silence stretched between them. Then, the smile on Shannon's face twisted, unnatural. A voice, not her own, echoed in Sarah's mind. Stay forever. Before Sarah could react, the shadows in the room surged forward, wrapping around Shannon's form, pulling her into the darkness. It wasn't her niece anymore. It was something else. Something that had taken her. And in the same instant, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder.
Cold.
Deadly cold. She turned, her eyes wide with terror. But there was no one there. Only the oppressive darkness. Welcome, came the voice again, not from the doorway, but from within her own mind. The shadows closed in. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing. She tried to back away, but the darkness seemed to pull her forward, tugging at her very soul. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, swirling around her like 1,000 voices pressing into her skull. Stay, stay, stay with us. The words echoed in her mind, relentless and suffocating. Her heart pounded, her body frozen, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the presence in the room. Her feet felt like lead, her hands trembling at her sides. She wanted to scream, to run, but the darkness was everywhere now. It wrapped around her, tightening, choking the air from her lungs. The shadows began to shift, to move in unnatural ways. Figures rose from the blackness, like tall, thin shapes emerging from the walls themselves. Sarah's eyes darted from one to the next, but they all looked the same, blank, featureless, empty. The air was ice, so cold that she could see her breath fogging in front of her. The voices, the whispers, they were growing louder now, filling the room, filling her mind. Shannon. Her name was drawn out, low and guttural, and it felt like it was coming from inside her own head. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, gasping for air. The figures in the room moved closer, surrounding her, their forms a swirling mass of darkness and shadow. And then, from the deepest corner of the room, the figure appeared again. The one who had haunted her niece. The one who had claimed her. Its tall, skeletal form emerged from the dark, its eyes, if you could call them eyes, empty, hollow voids that seemed to suck in all light. It was the same as before, but something was different now. Something far worse. It stepped forward, and as it did, the shadows seemed to bend and shift with its movement. Its voice was a hiss, a low, sickly sound that reverberated in her bones. "Now, you're one of us." It reached out, its fingers impossibly long, grasping at Sarah's wrist, and she felt the coldest sensation she had ever known. Her skin tingled where its fingers touched, burning with an icy flame that spread quickly through her arm, her chest, her heart. She tried to pull away, but it was too strong. Too fast. The figure leaned closer, its face, its void, coming inches from hers. The darkness behind its form seemed to grow, swelling, consuming everything in its wake. "Join us," it whispered. But as Sarah struggled, as the figure's fingers began to tighten, a faint sound cut through the chaos. A door creaked open. The dark figures paused, as if sensing the change. A figure, small and trembling, stepped into the room, Shannon's. Sarah gasped, her voice weak. But it wasn't Shannon. It was someone else. Someone familiar, but wrong. The new figure was distorted, its features warped, like a reflection in cracked glass. Its eyes, hollow and black, stared back at Sarah with an unsettling emptiness. "Please." The voice was familiar, but it wasn't Shannon's. It was wrong. "Please don't let it take you." The shadowed figure behind Sarah turned toward the new arrival, its gaze fixed and knowing. The room seemed to darken even further, as though the very light was being absorbed by the shape of the void that had taken over. And then, as if answering an unspoken command, the figure reached out, its skeletal hand stretching toward the new arrival. "Join us," it said, its voice deep and ancient, like a song from another time. Sarah's breath hitched as she saw the new figure, the distorted one, take a step forward into the darkness. It wasn't Shannon. It was someone else who had been swallowed by the house. Another soul, lost in its insatiable hunger. And now it was Sarah's turn. She reached for the light, for any hope, but the darkness closed in like a wave, dragging her deeper into the void. With a final, desperate scream, Sarah was pulled into the cold embrace of the shadows. And the house, once again, stood silent, empty, waiting. The darkness, ever hungry, stretched its fingers deeper into the night. And the cycle continued. The house stood still, its silence heavy and unnerving, like it had been holding its breath for far too long. Outside, the moon was shrouded in thick clouds, casting everything in an eerie, unnatural glow. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but within the house, there was nothing but silence. The door, which had been left ajar, creaked slowly in the breeze, as though it was hesitant to allow anything to enter. But enter did. A car pulled up outside, its headlights briefly illuminating the darkened front yard. A woman stepped out, her figure framed by the flickering lights of the car. She had dark hair, pulled back into a messy bun, and a determined look in her eyes. Her name was Claire. She was Sarah's sister, and she had come to find out what had happened. She had heard the whispers on the phone, heard the strange things that her sister and niece had said when they tried to call, but nothing prepared her for this. The air around the house felt wrong. It was thicker than it should have been, heavier. As Claire approached the door, she hesitated for just a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed the door open, the creak echoing in the stillness, and stepped inside. The house seemed empty, too empty. There was no noise, no signs of life. She took a deep breath and called out softly, "Sarah? Shannon?" No answer. Her fingers gripped the edge of the doorframe as she stepped further in, the cold air seeping into her skin. It was unbearable. The chill settled into her bones, making every movement feel sluggish. "Where are you?" she called again, her voice trembling slightly. The house didn't answer. It didn't seem to want to. Her gaze drifted toward the hallway at the end of the room. The faint light at the top of the stairs flickered. It was dim, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something had been up there recently. Claire moved slowly, cautiously, as if the air itself might reach out and snatch her. Each step she took seemed to echo, louder than it should. But when she reached the stairs, she stopped. A figure stood at the top. Shannon.
No.
It wasn't Shannon. Not completely. The girl standing there was tall, impossibly thin, her face blank, featureless, just like the others Claire had heard about. Her eyes were empty holes, black and deep, swallowing everything in sight. And then that voice. "Come closer." It wasn't Shannon's voice. It was cold, hollow, as if the very air had turned into a living thing. Claire's chest tightened. A chill crawled up her spine. "Shannon," she called, her voice breaking. "What have they done to you?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its form so still that it felt as if it had become part of the darkness. But then, the shadows around her began to shift. The walls seemed to stretch, distorting in a way that made Claire feel as if she were losing her grip on reality. And then, the whispering returned. It was faint at first, but soon it filled the room, coming from all directions. "Join us. Stay forever." The air turned cold, and Claire realized the shadows weren't just on the walls. They were moving, reaching out toward her. The figure at the top of the stairs began to sway, like a marionette on invisible strings. "Come." The voice whispered again. "Come and stay." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped backward, but the shadows moved with her, closing the distance between them. Her breath caught in her throat. There was nowhere to run. She turned and bolted for the door, but just as her fingers touched the handle, the air shifted, and the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out. Complete darkness. She spun around, panic rising in her chest. The shadows closed in, and in the thick, suffocating blackness, Claire's only thought was one word: escape. But it was already too late. The whispers rose into a crescendo, and the house had already claimed her. With a final, desperate scream, Claire was swallowed by the shadows. And the house stood silent again.
Empty.
Waiting. The cycle would never end. The house stood in silence, once more, as if it had never known the presence of its newest victim. The wind howled outside, brushing against the windows like a distant cry, but within, there was no sound, no movement. The darkness seemed to settle deeper into the rooms, pressing against the walls, waiting. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. No one noticed the missing people. No one noticed the house at all. But inside, the shadows stirred. The door, still shut tight, seemed to hold something that wasn't supposed to be there. And then, in the distance, a sound. A car's tires crunching on gravel. A figure appeared at the end of the street, silhouetted against the streetlights. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and his pace was deliberate as he made his way up the path toward the house. His name was James. He had been out of town for a few days, visiting his mother, but he'd received strange messages, texts, missed calls from his wife, Sarah. And when he couldn't reach her, the gnawing suspicion that something was terribly wrong pulled him back here. He didn't know what had happened to Sarah, to Claire, or to anyone who had stepped foot in that cursed house. But he knew they weren't just missing. They were gone. He reached the door, his hand resting on the cold metal of the doorknob. It didn't creak this time when he twisted it. It opened smoothly, easily. Inside, the house felt different. The air was thick, oppressive. As he stepped into the foyer, James's eyes immediately scanned the room. It was empty as it should be, but the silence in the house felt unnatural. And then the whispering started. It wasn't loud at first, but it was there.
Low. Soft.
The words almost lost in the air. James. His name. He froze. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. "Sarah," he called, his voice trembling. But no answer came. "James, come closer." The whispering continued, growing louder, filling the air with its cold, insistent pull. The voice came from the top of the stairs, faint but unmistakable. He didn't know why he moved forward, but his feet carried him, one step after another, up the stairs. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, but he couldn't. The house seemed to pull him, to call him, as if it knew him, as if it was waiting for him. At the top of the stairs, he paused. The hallway stretched out before him, darker than it should have been. The light above flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move as though alive. "Sarah," he called again, his voice much quieter now. There was no answer, only the faint whispers. "Come stay with us." The shadows in the hall seemed to grow longer, thicker, twisting like snakes on the walls. The temperature dropped, a coldness settling over his skin like ice. James's pulse raced. "Stay." The voice urged again, low and slow, like a chant. "Stay forever." He turned toward the room at the far end of the hallway. It was the same room where Sarah had last been, the room where she had disappeared. His hands clenched at his sides as he took a step toward it, his breath shallow, the cold air stinging his skin. The door was open just slightly, a sliver of darkness spilling out. He reached for the handle, but before his fingers could touch it, something caught his eye. A figure, tall, gaunt, and unnaturally still, stood in the doorway of the room, just outside his reach. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, like an abyss that threatened to swallow everything in its wake. Its face was a hollow, black void. Nothing there, only darkness. And then it spoke. "James." The whisper was like ice against his bones. "Come." It took one step forward, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist as it moved. James's heart pounded. He knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't his wife. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anyone he knew. The figure stepped into the light, its form growing larger, its presence swallowing the hallway. "Join us." The darkness wrapped around him, tightening, pulling him in. His breath caught in his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadows closed in around him, suffocating him in a cold, dead silence. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything went still again. The whispers faded. The darkness withdrew. The house stood empty once more. No one would ever know what happened to James. No one would ever know what had become of Sarah, Claire, or the others. But the house remained, waiting for the next. And the cycle continued. The house sat silent in the night, its windows dark, its doors locked, its rooms empty. But the silence was not peaceful. It was thick, heavy, like a storm hanging in the air, waiting for the right moment to strike. The street outside was empty, the air unnaturally still. Then a car pulled up. It was an old sedan, its headlights piercing through the dark, casting long shadows on the driveway. The car door opened, and a figure stepped out. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and a determined look on his face. His name was Mark, and he was James's brother. Mark had heard the news. He had heard about the strange disappearances, the missing neighbors, the whispered stories, but none of it made sense. And so he came to find his brother, to find Sarah, to find out what had happened. He walked up to the front door, his footsteps steady, but his heart racing. The house loomed before him, dark and silent. He reached for the doorknob, feeling the cold metal under his fingers. It turned without resistance, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the house was still, too still. There was no creaking of floors, no movement of air. Just silence. Mark stepped inside, glancing around the room. The furniture was undisturbed, the dust on the floor undisturbed, as if time had forgotten this place. His eyes narrowed, and he took a deep breath. Something was wrong. He could feel it. He called out softly, "James?" There was no answer. His footsteps echoed as he moved deeper into the house, the air growing colder with every step. He made his way toward the stairs, glancing up. The upper floor was shrouded in darkness, but a faint light flickered from the hallway. It beckoned him, like a whisper from beyond. Mark's pulse quickened as he climbed the stairs, the shadows around him growing darker with each step. At the top of the stairs, he saw it, the door. It was slightly open, just like the others had been. The same room, the same place. But this time, there was a new presence in the air. A low hum, a soft whisper, and then a voice. "Mark." It came from the darkness beyond the door. He froze. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was James's voice. "James?" Mark whispered, taking a step toward the door. But something stopped him. The temperature had dropped. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen. He reached for the door, but as his fingers brushed against the wood, he hesitated. The whispering intensified. "Mark, don't." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't James's. It was a deeper voice, an older voice. A hollow voice. Mark's hand trembled as he pushed the door open, his breath quick and shallow. The room inside was cloaked in darkness, so thick that it felt like it was swallowing everything around it. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The figure. The same tall, skeletal form that had haunted the others. It stood at the far end of the room, unmoving, its black eyes fixed on him. "Join us." The voice slithered through the air, a twisted version of the words he had heard before. Mark's heart raced in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to run. But the darkness around him seemed to tighten, like a noose around his neck. "Mark, stay." The voice was louder now, like a chorus of whispers, growing stronger, more insistent. And in that moment, Mark knew there was no escape. The figure stepped forward, its long fingers stretching toward him, each movement fluid, unnatural. The shadows swirled and twisted, as if they were alive, reaching for him, pulling him in. Mark stumbled back, his breath ragged, but his legs wouldn't move. The darkness had him now. The last thing he saw before the shadows consumed him was the figure's face, a void, a black pit of nothingness. And then, the house was silent again. No whispering, no movement. The door, once slightly ajar, was now fully closed. But the house wasn't empty. Not anymore. And it would never be again. The cycle continued. And the house waited. The house stood in eerie silence, the air still and thick, pressing down on everything within. Its windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch the street below with an unsettling patience. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale, sickly orb, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard. Inside, the rooms were as empty as they had been for years. Except they weren't empty anymore. The shadows had taken root here. They had spread, seeped into the walls, the floors, the very fabric of the house. They had become part of it. The house was no longer just a house. It was something else. A man stood on the threshold, looking at the old building. His name was Michael, and he had come to settle his brother's affairs. To clear out the house, to make it disappear the way it had once been. He didn't know why he felt this strange pull, this deep-seated unease as he approached the door. But something was drawing him in. The door opened on its own, as if it had been waiting for him. The cold inside the house hit him like a slap in the face. "Hellos?" His voice echoed in the empty halls. No response. He stepped inside, every footfall sharp in the silence. The air felt damp, like it had been trapped inside for years. It clung to his skin, making him shiver. He had seen the reports, the disappearances, the strange events that surrounded this house. But they were just stories, right? Urban legends. Nothing more. Except, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. His eyes moved over the walls, the dark corners, the faint outlines of furniture shrouded in dust and decay. Then a noise. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible. "Michael." He froze. His heart skipped a beat. "Michael, come closer." The voice was low, familiar, yet not. It didn't sound like anyone he knew, but it held an undeniable pull. He followed the sound, his legs moving of their own accord, bringing him toward the stairs at the end of the hallway. The shadows in the corners of the house shifted, twisting like living things, stretching as though they were aware of his presence. He reached the stairs, and there, at the top, was a figure. A woman. Her face was pale, drained of color, her eyes sunken and black. It wasn't his brother's wife. It wasn't anyone he recognized. The figure smiled, a wide, distorted grin that stretched unnaturally across her face. "Join us," she whispered, her voice more forceful now. Michael's breath caught. He stepped back, but the shadows surged forward, swallowing him in their cold embrace. His heart pounded as the darkness encased him. The walls of the house seemed to close in, the air thick with an oppressive pressure. He gasped for air, but it was useless. The shadows were everywhere now, swirling around him, pulling at him, drawing him into the very walls of the house. The last thing he saw before the blackness consumed him was the figure at the top of the stairs, her hollow eyes watching him with a strange sense of satisfaction. And then there was nothing. The house stood silent once more, but it wasn't empty. The cycle had begun again. The house waited. The shadows whispered. And the next soul was claimed. As it had always been. And as it always would be, the house stood silent once again, its windows dark, its doors closed tight. The air had thickened, weighed down by the years of suffering, the endless cycle of shadows and whispers. It felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to stir. But for now there was nothing. The street outside remained empty, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. A stillness had descended over everything, as though the entire world had forgotten about the house that stood at the edge of town. The trees that once seemed alive with whispers and movement were now still, their limbs heavy with the weight of time. Inside, there was no sign of life. But something was different. Something had changed. The door creaked open once more, this time without a hand to turn the knob. A figure stepped inside, and it was clear from the first glance that this was no ordinary visitor. There was no sense of fear, no hesitation in the way the figure moved. It was as if they belonged here, as if they had always belonged. The man, tall and cloaked in shadows, walked through the foyer with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. His face was obscured, but there was something about the way he moved that exuded an unsettling calm. He didn't flinch at the cold, oppressive air, nor did he react to the whispers that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the house. Finally, he murmured, his voice low and even. "I've come for what's mine." The house shuddered, as though it recognized him, as though it had been waiting. The shadows stretched toward him, twisting and undulating, but they didn't reach him. Instead, they seemed to bow before him, as if they were aware of his power. He made his way up the stairs, his eyes focused on the dark room at the end of a hallway. The house creaked under his weight, but there was no resistance. It was as though the house itself had already surrendered to him. He stopped at the door. And then, with a single gesture, he opened it. The room beyond was darker than ever. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around him like a swarm of insects. But the figure didn't react. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the whispers stopped. The shadows retreated. And the house, finally, was still. The figure had claimed what he had come for, and the cycle, at last, was broken. The house no longer hungered for souls, no longer needed to feed. It had been consumed from the inside out, and now it was nothing. Outside, the storm that had been brewing for so long passed, and the first light of dawn touched the sky. The house, empty for the first time in years, was no longer a place of nightmares. It was simply a house, nothing more, nothing less. And so, as the sun rose over the silent streets, the house stood quiet, waiting. But this time, not for another soul, just for time to pass. And with that, the story of the house came to an end.